The floorboards were always cold in the morning, as if the sea itself had crept through the cracks during the night. David Harrison woke to that sensation every day, the sharp sting of chill rising through the soles of his feet, crawling into his bones. It was a reminder, as steady as the tide outside, that he was alive, and that the Oregon coast would never let him forget where he lived. A damp, invasive cold, indifferent and permanent. He sat up slowly on the narrow bed, joints aching with the familiar protest of age. At 65, his body carried its own map of battles, creases, scars, a stiffness that no stretching could erase. His cabin, tucked into the bluff above Seabrook's ragged shoreline, was small and rough-hewn, but it suited him. Here, discipline ruled. Everything was simple, deliberate, stripped of complication. David dressed in silence. Thermal shirt, faded jeans, thick wool socks. His reflection in the window was a tall, wiry figure with iron-gray hair cropped short. His face looked carved from weathered wood, stern, with deep lines across the brow. Yet his eyes betrayed him, blue, tired, softer than he wished. He turned away before they could hold him too long. On the rug by the hearth stirred the one creature that tethered him to the present. Shadow lifted his great head, golden eyes blinking open. The German shepherd stretched, muscles rolling under his silver-gray coat, and padded over. He pressed his muzzle into David's hand. No bark, no rush of energy, just steady presence. David stroked him once behind the ears, murmuring, "Morning, boy." Their routine was a fortress. Coffee beans measured with military precision. Grinder roaring like a brief machine gun burst, shattering the dawn silence. Boiling water. 2 mugs. One steaming black for David, one lukewarm filled with water for Shadow. They sat together at the table, man and dog watching the eastern sky lighten from bruised purple to iron gray. Then came the walk. Boots laced tight, flannel shirt buttoned against the wet chill. Shadow at the door, tail swishing once in anticipation. They stepped into fog that swallowed the world whole. The Pacific crashed somewhere beyond the mist, muffled, rhythmic. Their trail wound through wet grass and scrub pine down to the sand, where no footprints ever lingered long. The beach was theirs alone. Cold sand stretched vast and empty, sea stacks looming like ancient sentinels. Gulls wheeled invisibly in the fog, their cries distant and strange. David kept his gaze low, eyes fixed on the sand just ahead of his boots. He never looked at the horizon. Horizons carried questions, and questions led to memories. Memories were what he had built this exile to silence. They walked for exactly 1 hour, Shadow at his heel, never straying, never chasing birds. His presence was discipline embodied, as if the dog understood this march was not for exercise, but survival. The crunch of boots, the hush of waves, the rhythm of breath. This was the mantra that kept the past walled off. Yet the ocean was treacherous. Its sounds were not always benign. Sometimes a wave struck the shore just so, echoing like rotor blades winding up. The fog would twist in a gust of wind, and suddenly it wasn't fog at all, but jungle smoke clinging to his throat. This morning, it came sharp and fast. The hiss of surf turned into artillery. Salt air became jet fuel and rot. His chest seized. He stumbled, vision narrowing, and behind his eyelids exploded the image he had buried. The radio handset slick with sweat, coordinates barked, thunder not of storms but of steel raining down. For a split second, he saw the huts, the silence after. David's hand curled into a fist, nails biting his palm. He squeezed his eyes shut. Breathe in salt, breathe out smoke. His chest heaved, then warm pressure against his hand. Shadow. The dog nosed him firmly, a low whine vibrating in his chest. Those golden eyes, steady and watchful, anchored him. David's fist unclenched, his palm settled into fur, warmth, real, alive. He exhaled long, ragged. "I'm all right, boy." They stood in the mist until his heart slowed, until the beach became only a beach again. Together, they turned back toward the cabin, finishing their route. The rest of the day unfolded like a carbon copy of all the days before. Repairs on the fence. Oil rubbed into the handle of a rusting axe, soup simmering in a dented pot, silence thick as fog filling every space. The world beyond Seabrook might have been roaring with politics, headlines, noise, but here time was static. A man, a dog, and the ritual that guarded against collapse. Days blurred. The fissure of panic on the beach smoothed over beneath the mortar of habit. Dawn after dawn, David repeated the same motions, the same measured steps. Shadow watched with quiet patience. Then came the morning that shattered the pattern. The fog was heavier than usual, a dense curtain pressing in. They were midway through their walk, approaching the basalt outcrop that marked their turning point, when Shadow froze. It was not a casual pause, it was rigid, alert, every muscle tight. David, lost in thought, took 2 steps before realizing his companion was no longer at his side. He turned. Shadow stood still, ears pricked forward, nose pointed toward the right, toward a stretch of jagged shoreline David always avoided. Treacherous rocks, slick with algae, dangerous when the tide turned. "Come on, boy," David said firmly, gesturing back to their route. But Shadow did not move. A low whine rose from his chest, urgent, insistent. He looked back at David, then forward again, as if pleading. David frowned. In all their years together, Shadow had never challenged the path, never pulled, never resisted. But now, the dog stepped forward, then back, tail stiff, gaze locked on the hidden rocks. He tugged gently at David's jeans with his mouth. Something cold slid down David's spine. This was not stubbornness, it was conviction. He hesitated, caught in the grip of 2 instincts. The first, retreat to safety, stay within the lines he had drawn, guard the fragile order. The second, trust the dog who had never led him astray. The fog swirled thick around them. Shadow whined again, eyes blazing with urgency. David exhaled slowly. "All right," he murmured. "Lead the way, but careful." Shadow surged forward, not reckless, but deliberate. Paws picking their way across the rocks with uncanny surety. David followed, boots scraping, lungs tight. The roar of surf dulled as the passage narrowed between basalt walls. They climbed, scrambled, squeezed. The world seemed to hush. Then, suddenly, the passage opened. A hidden cove lay before them, crescent-shaped, sand untouched, cliffs looming high. Fog drifted in ribbons across the still air. It was a place apart from time, a secret pocket of the coast, and there resting just above the tide line was something that did not belong. David stopped dead, heart lurching against his ribs. Round, woven bamboo, black resin gleaming in the dim light, a basket boat. His breath caught, his vision tilted. The Oregon air vanished, replaced by the suffocating humidity of another world. The Mekong Delta, river mud, insects buzzing, families paddling in boats just like this one. Then thunder, screams, silence. He staggered, gripping a rock for balance. His chest hammered. The impossible object sat solid and real before him, its curved hull like an accusation. Shadow stood beside him, tail stiff, gaze fixed on the boat. David could not move, could not breathe. The ocean had delivered something from a war he thought he had buried. But why here? Why now? The fog curled around the strange vessel, as if guarding its secret. David's pulse pounded in his ears as he whispered to himself, "What in God's name?" And then he saw it something glinting faintly inside the boat's rim, a flash of metal. He took one slow, trembling step forward, and froze. Because if he touched it, there would be no turning back. David stood frozen on the sand, lungs tight, eyes locked on the object that had no business being here. The cove around him felt like a dream, a pocket of silence tucked away from the roar of the Pacific. And yet, what lay before him was too solid, too real. It was small and round, about 10 feet across, its shape alien among the driftwood and kelp. The surface was black resin, dulled by salt, but strong, gleaming faintly through the mist. Beneath the resin, he could see the weave of bamboo strips, carefully bound, stubbornly intact. He knew it instantly, though it had been more than 50 years since he'd last seen one. A basket boat. The sight hit him like a fist. His knees weakened. Sweat broke cold across his forehead, despite the chill. The air around him warped, pulling him backward through time. The Mekong Delta. The smell of mud, thick and sweet, fish sauce fermenting in clay jars, smoke rising from cooking fires. The buzz of cicadas, the cough of a distant engine. Families moving silently in boats, just like this one, mothers crouched low, children clutching at baskets of vegetables. Then, the flash, the thunder, the splintering of wood, and screams. David sucked in a sharp breath and staggered back, boots digging furrows in the wet sand. His chest heaved as if he had run a mile uphill. Shadow pressed against his leg, whining low, golden eyes searching his face. The dog could smell the storm inside him, could feel the violence of memory pressing hard against the present. David closed his eyes, breathed salt, not smoke, waves, not rotor blades. His mantra steadied him just enough to keep from collapsing. When he opened his eyes, the boat was still there. Not a hallucination, not a trick of mist and memory. Real, solid, waiting. He swallowed hard, throat dry. Logic roared against the impossible. He knew the sea. He had lived beside it for decades, had studied currents, storms, the ruthless gyres of the Pacific. For a fragile, rudderless craft to survive, the crossing from Asia to this secluded cove was absurd. For it to arrive intact, and here, of all places, his hidden stretch of coast was beyond chance. It felt less like debris and more like a message. Shadow padded forward, nose quivering, tail low. He circled the strange vessel cautiously, sniffing. Then he paused, ears pricking, gaze fixed on something along the rim. David squinted. A faint glint of metal caught the dim light. His stomach clenched. Against every instinct screaming at him to turn back, he stepped closer. His boots sank into wet sand. His hand trembled as he reached for the edge of the boat. The resin felt rough beneath his fingertips, slick with salt but firm. His palm lingered there, as if touching the vessel might burn him. He leaned over the rim. Inside, a shallow pool of seawater gleamed. Nestled in it, half submerged, were objects. Relics. The first he lifted was a lighter. A Zippo. Chrome-pitted and scarred, but unmistakable in shape. His thumb flicked the wheel automatically. A useless scrape. No flame. On one side, etched deep into the metal, was a peace sign. David's chest constricted. He had seen dozens of these during the war soldiers, scratching defiance into their gear. A desperate reminder that they once wanted peace. He closed his fist around it, knuckles whitening. He set the lighter down carefully on the sand and reached again. His fingers closed on a thin chain, brittle with rust. He drew it up, and from its end dangled a single dog tag. Silver, worn nearly smooth, letters erased by time and friction. He tilted it back and forth, searching for a name, a blood type, anything. But the surface was ghostly blank. A soldier's identity rubbed away by decades of salt water. David stared at it, chest hollow. A lost name, a silenced life. Shadow whined again, louder this time. David turned. The dog was standing stiff at the far side of the boat, paw scraping against something lashed inside with rope. A faded canvas-wrapped buoy, stained orange and black with mildew, heavy and strange. "Leave it," David said hoarsely. Shadow ignored him. The shepherd's nose pressed hard against the canvas, paw clawing insistently. A growl of frustration rumbled in his throat. David's frown deepened. This was not idle curiosity. This was urgency. The same focus Shadow showed when he had cornered a raccoon under the cabin floorboards. A signal. Here. This matters. Setting the dog tag aside, David crouched, hands stiff with hesitation. The canvas was rough under his fingers, rope knots hardened with salt. He pulled, nails digging, until the first knot gave, then another. At last, he heaved the buoy free. It landed on the sand with a solid thud, heavier than it had any right to be. He frowned. A buoy should be light, filled with cork or foam. But this was dense, unyielding. Something was inside. His heart hammered. He pulled the small utility knife from his pocket, the same one he used for cutting rope or sharpening stakes. With careful pressure, he sliced through the canvas. The fabric tore reluctantly. Inside, instead of cork, was a core of crumbling foam. Hollowed into its center was a box. David's breath caught. Olive, drab, metal, military issue. Waterproof, shockproof. He knew it instantly. He had carried one just like it through the jungles of Vietnam. He reached in, hands trembling, and pulled it free. Cold, heavy, as though it carried more than just metal. For a long moment, he simply sat in the sand, staring at it. The surf hissed, the fog swirled, Shadow pressed close. His pulse thundered. Finally, with numb fingers, he snapped the latches. Metal clicked sharp in the stillness. The lid creaked open. Inside lay a single packet, thick plastic sealed tight, transparent enough to reveal folded sheets of paper within. Crisp, dry, preserved against the sea. On top of the bundle rested a thin leather notebook, edges swollen with age but intact. David's throat closed. His hands shook as he lifted them out. The plastic was cool, the leather rough. His name wasn't written there, but it felt as if these objects had been waiting for him all along. He wanted to drop them back, slam the lid, throw the entire thing into the surf, to let the ocean reclaim its burden, but he couldn't. Not now. Not after finding it here, in this impossible cove, with Shadow refusing to move until he had looked inside. The weight of it was more than physical. It was a summons. He pressed the sealed packet to his chest, staring at the mist curling around the cliffs, his breath fogged in the cold air. The sea whispered relentlessly, as if urging him forward. A sudden gust pushed through the cove, rattling driftwood, carrying the salt sting sharper than before. The notebook in his hand fluttered open slightly, pages yellowed but legible. On the first line, written in firm, disciplined script, were words that made David's heart stutter. To the brother who finds this, The rest was hidden by the fold, but already his vision blurred. His jaw tightened. He shut the notebook quickly, unable to take more. Not yet. Not here. The air pressed heavy against him, the cliffs looming close. His knees felt weak. Shadow whined again, nudging him toward the path out of the cove. He stuffed the notebook and the sealed letter back into the box, closed the latches with trembling hands, and lifted it against his chest. The weight dragged at him as he climbed back over the rocks, every step echoing with the certainty that his world had shifted. By the time he and Shadow reached the cabin, the box felt fused to his arms. He set it on the wooden table in the center of the room. The entire cabin seemed to reorient itself around it, as though the box were a hidden sun pulling everything into orbit. The stove, the books, the worn armchair all looked suddenly small, meaningless. He stared at it for hours, unable to open it again, unable to ignore it either. Night came. Wind pressed against the windows, carrying the ocean's endless breath. David sat hunched in the dark, Shadow at his feet, the box on the table between them. He ran his hands over the latches again and again, but did not lift them. Not yet. Finally, near midnight, he leaned back, eyes burning, whispering to the dog, "What the hell did we bring home, boy?" Shadow's ears twitched, head tilting, gaze steady on him. The box sat, silent, patient, waiting. And through the silence, David thought he heard it, not the sea, not the wind, but something else. A voice, faint as memory, rising from the sealed packet inside. "To the brother who finds this." The words reverberated in his skull, as if someone had spoken them aloud in the cabin. David jerked upright, breath caught in his throat. The box gleamed faintly in the firelight, and he realized with a jolt of dread and wonder. He was no longer sure if the message inside was meant to be read, or answered. The night stretched long and merciless. David sat at the table, the metal box before him like an unexploded shell. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, the cabin cold, but his palms sweated. Shadow lay close, chin on his paws, amber eyes fixed on his master, a quiet sentinel. David's gaze never left the box. He had lived by discipline, order, silence, routine, but this thing had shattered all of it. The words he had glimpsed, "to the brother who finds this," ran in endless circles through his mind. It was not curiosity that gnawed at him now. It was inevitability. Near dawn, with shadows stretched long across the floorboards, he gave in. His fingers, stiff with dread, snapped the latches again. The hinges creaked softly. He lifted the packet sealed in plastic, peeled at the edge until it tore with a sharp crackle. The sound felt violent in the silence, like a shot fired indoors. He drew out the folded papers, his heart thudding against his ribs. The handwriting was neat, tight, the script of a man accustomed to precision. He held his breath and began to read. "To the brother who finds this. My name is Sergeant Samuel T. Caldwell. I write not for forgiveness, for I know I deserve none, but because silence is a weight that can crush a man's soul. I carried mine too long. If you hold this letter, it means my confession has reached another pair of hands, another soldier perhaps, another haunted man. Then my words are not lost to the sea." David's throat tightened. His eyes traced each line with grim inevitability. It was 1973, Quang Ngai Province. We were told the river carried supplies for the Viet Cong. We set the ambush. The order was given. We opened fire. Minutes later, when the silence came back, I saw the truth. No rifles, no ammunition, only baskets of vegetables, nets, mothers, children, all gone. That day never ended for me. I lived it every night. I am still living it now, as my hand writes these words. The page trembled in David's grip. The words blurred. He could see it himself, though it had not been the same river, not the same patrol. But the mechanics of the horror were identical. Orders given, fire unleashed, silence afterward, more terrible than the noise. He set the page down, chest heaving. The cabin walls pressed in. His memories surged the call over the radio. Coordinates confirmed, the thunder of shells landing in a farming hamlet. He had sealed that image behind walls of routine for 50 years. Samuel's words tore those walls apart. Shadow whined softly, pressing his head against David's thigh. David's fingers buried in the dog's fur, clutching it like rope thrown to a drowning man. He forced himself back to the letter. I came home, but I never truly left. The ghosts sat at my table, followed me into bed. I tried to drown them in drink, tried to bury them under work. Nothing silenced them. Years passed. Then I met refugees in Astoria Vietnamese fishermen who had fled the war we left behind. I asked them to teach me their craft. I learned to split bamboo, to weave, to seal it with resin until it could float. They did not know why I was obsessed. They did not know I was building the very vessel that haunted me. My penance, my prayer. David closed his eyes. He could picture it. Old hands splitting bamboo, weaving it with stubborn patience. Building not a boat, but a monument to regret. When the boat was finished, I placed this letter inside, along with relics of my time, a lighter, a tag, a box. I set it adrift, foolish as it was, because I could no longer carry it alone. Wherever it landed, I prayed it would find someone who understood, not to forgive me, but to know the weight. That is all I ask, to be understood by one brother before the tide takes me forever. The letter ended. David sat motionless, the papers limp in his hands. His breath rattled. The silence in the cabin was alive, heavy, full of ghosts, his and Samuel's, tangled into one. He thought of the man, old and frail, building a boat with trembling hands, sealing this confession into its heart, surrendering it to the ocean, the sheer blind faith of it. And now, here it sat on his table, delivered not to a stranger, but to him. His chest constricted with a paradoxical relief and agony. For 50 years he had carried his guilt alone, convinced it was a singular monstrosity. Now here was proof. Another man bore the same wound, the same silence. David folded the letter carefully, slid it back into the plastic sleeve, and closed the box. But the silence that followed was different now. It was no longer empty. It was crowded with presence. Hours passed. The tide rose and fell unseen outside. David did not eat, did not sleep. He simply sat, lost in the looping images of his own past. By evening, he could bear it no longer. He pulled on his boots and drove the rattling truck into town. Shadow watched him leave, ears low, posture alert, as if guarding the boat itself. The drive to Port Orford felt like moving through a foreign land. Noise, cars, neon signs, each jarring against the silence of his cove. He parked by the small brick library, its windows glowing warm in the dusk. Inside, the smell of paper and lemon polish washed over him. The librarian, Eleanor Vance, looked up from her desk. Her gray hair was tied neatly, her glasses perched low. She smiled politely. David hesitated, words rusted in his throat. Then he managed, "I'm looking for something. Stories. About the war. Not history books. Personal stories." Her eyes softened, understanding flickering. She wrote a note, slid it across the counter. "The Keepsake Project. It's an archive online," she explained gently. "Veterans and families sharing objects, confessions, memories, honest ones. If you're searching, it's a good place to start." David nodded stiffly, throat tight. He took the note, clutched it like a lifeline. That night, he sat again at the table, the box in front of him, the slip of paper beside it. He lit the stove, but the fire gave no warmth. The glow of the lamp painted the cabin in weary gold. He whispered to Shadow. "They called it a keepsake, a place where ghosts are kept." The dog thumped his tail once, as if in agreement. David looked at the box, then at the paper with the website's name. His heart pounded with something he hadn't felt in years, fear of the outside world, of connection. But beneath it was something stronger, the faintest flicker of purpose. The letter had found him. Now it was his turn to find the rest of the story. He leaned back, exhaling hard, staring at the shadows flickering on the walls. The cabin seemed smaller than ever, too small to contain what he now carried. Shadow lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the window. David turned. Out beyond the glass, through the fog rolling in from the sea, he thought he saw a faint shape at the tree line, a figure standing still, watching. He blinked, heart hammering. The mist shifted. The figure was gone. But the question remained, lodged like a splinter in his chest. Had the boat carried only a letter across the ocean, or something else with it? David woke the next morning with the uneasy weight of the night still heavy on his chest. He had barely slept, every creak of the cabin making him glance toward the window, where he thought he'd seen someone standing. In the pale dawn light, the trees were empty, only the mist drifting like slow smoke across the cove. Still, the unease lingered. The box sat exactly where he'd left it on the table, squat and patient, as though it knew he couldn't ignore it forever. The slip of paper with the librarian's neat handwriting lay beside it, the Keepsake Project. For hours, he paced the cabin, torn between retreat and action. Shadow followed his every step, tail low, eyes filled with the kind of loyalty that demanded an answer. When David finally pulled on his boots, the dog lifted his head, as if to say, "About time." The library was quiet again, the same smell of paper and polish. David made his way to the row of computers at the back, choosing the farthest one, the one with its back to the room. He had never owned a computer. The plastic mouse felt alien, the keyboard clunky beneath his calloused hands. He tried typing, stumbled, cursed under his breath. After several minutes of fumbling, frustration boiled. Eleanor appeared at his shoulder, smiling gently. "Need some help?" He almost refused. Pride stiff in his throat, but something in her kind eyes loosened him. He nodded once. She clicked deftly, opened a browser, typed the address. "You just type here," she said, pointing to the bar. "Take your time, no rush." When she walked away, he exhaled shakily. The screen glowed with the homepage of the Keepsake Project. A photograph dominated the center, a pair of worn combat boots resting on wooden floorboards, laces undone. Beneath, a simple line of text. "Every object carries a story. Every story carries a soul." David's hand trembled on the mouse. He clicked on Objects and Stories. The page filled with images. A dented canteen with initials scratched into the side, a faded love letter written in pencil, a child's drawing smudged with dirt, a rusted bayonet. Each object was a link to a story. He scrolled slowly, his throat tight, the weight of memory pressing harder with each image. Then, his eyes caught a search bar. His pulse quickened. He typed, "Samuel T. Caldwell." The screen blinked. No results found. His gut twisted. He tried again, this time just Samuel Caldwell. The page filled with hundreds of entries too many. He scrolled, scanned, each line a ghost calling from the screen. Overwhelmed, he closed his eyes, trying to recall the letter, the exact words. "Basket boat, Quang Ngai, 196th Infantry." He typed again. "Basket boat, Quang Ngai, 196th." This time, a single result appeared. His heart stopped. The title read, "My Father's Final Prayer, The Story of a Basket Boat," submitted by Sarah Caldwell. His hand shook as he clicked. The page opened to a photograph, sepia-toned, from the 1,970 seconds. A young soldier stared back at him, face solemn, eyes steady, hair dark beneath a helmet, tilted back. "Samuel?" David leaned closer, breath caught. The resemblance to the voice in the letter was undeniable. The caption beneath read, "Sergeant Samuel T. Caldwell, 196th Light Infantry Brigade, 1,973. Below the photograph was Sarah's story. "My father never spoke of the war. He worked as a carpenter, lived quietly, carried a sadness he could never name. Only after his death did I discover the truth." Among his papers were journals, letters, and photographs. For 30 years, he quietly funded schools and clinics in Quang Ngai, Vietnam, using most of his pension. He never told us why, only that it was something he had to do. A promise, maybe. A penance. I learned later about the boat he built with his own hands. He called it his prayer. Before he died, he asked me to record his words, to be sent out with the boat. I did not understand until I found this site. Now, I share his story, so it is not lost. Attached to the post were photographs. A one-story building with a hand-painted sign in Vietnamese and English, Hope and Renewal School. Another of a medical clinic, plain but sturdy, children smiling on the steps. David's eyes blurred. He wiped at them roughly, ashamed, even alone. This man had not just confessed, he had acted. For decades, quietly, relentlessly, he had tried to balance the scales. At the bottom of the page was a final entry, a video. This was recorded at his request, just before his death. He said it was for the boat. David hesitated. His finger hovered over the play button. His chest was tight, his pulse a heavy drum. He pulled out the tangled earbuds from his jacket pocket, the same pair he used when fixing fences. With hands that shook, he plugged them into the port. The video flickered to life. A dusty workshop, wood shavings scattered on the floor, a round boat resting behind the camera's edge. Then Samuel appeared, frail, white-haired, sitting on a stool. His eyes, those same kind, weary eyes from the photo, looked directly into the lens. "If you are seeing this," he said, voice thin but steady, "then my boat found a harbor." David's breath caught. Samuel went on. "A long time ago, I was part of something I cannot forget. I cannot undo it. I built this with my hands, hoping to turn my guilt into something whole. But a man cannot carry his ghosts forever. I am sending this boat out to the sea as my final prayer. It carries all I could never say. I hope it finds someone who understands. Maybe even someone who carries the same weight. If you are that man, then know you are not alone." The video ended. The screen went black. David sat frozen, earbuds still in his ears, tears hot on his cheeks. He could hear his own breathing, ragged and unsteady, loud against the silence. For the first time in decades, he whispered the truth aloud. "I did the same thing. God help me, I did the same thing." Shadow pressed close, head against his knee. David gripped the dog's fur like a rope. The library's silence stretched around him, but for once, it did not feel suffocating. It felt like the space after confession, the space where healing might begin. He removed the earbuds slowly, folded them into his palm, and sat back. The story was complete now. Samuel had carried the same wound, had found a way to make his life mean something beyond it. David's chest ached, but it was an ache mixed with awe. He closed the page, logged off, and rose from the chair. His knees trembled, but his steps were steady. Driving back along the coast, the sun hung low, casting the ocean in sheets of bronze. David glanced at the seat beside him, where the slip of paper lay. His hands tightened on the wheel. The world outside his exile was larger than he had allowed himself to believe. When he pulled into the gravel driveway, Shadow bounded out to greet him. David crouched, burying his face in the dog's fur, inhaling the grounding scent of earth and salt. Then he froze. The cabin door stood slightly ajar. He was certain he had locked it. The box Samuel's box was inside. His heart slammed against his ribs. He rose slowly, eyes sweeping the tree line, the shadows between the pines. The wind moved through the branches, whispering like distant voices, and the thought chilled him to the bone. What if someone else already knew about the boat? The gravel crunched too loudly under David's boots as he moved toward the cabin. His chest was tight, every instinct screaming for caution. He had lived in solitude long enough to know what was normal on this coast. A door ajar when it should be locked was not normal. Shadow patted at his side, hackles bristled, body rigid. The dog's low growl vibrated against the silence. David motioned with a hand stay low, and the shepherd crouched instinctively, eyes fixed on the cabin. The afternoon light was fading, the air cooling with that damp edge the Oregon coast carried at dusk. David's mind worked fast, scanning possibilities. Had the wind pushed the door open? Unlikely. He knew the lock, the frame, the stubborn way the hinges resisted. Someone had been here. He approached the porch slowly, each step deliberate. His hand hovered near the old hunting knife clipped at his belt. He hadn't carried a firearm in years, but the knife's weight was suddenly not enough. At the threshold, he paused, listening. The cabin was silent, only the creak of wood as the wind shifted. He pushed the door wider. The air inside was colder, as if the place had been emptied of warmth. His eyes swept the room, chair, stove, shelves, all intact. Then his gaze landed on the table, the box. Still there, closed, unmoved. Relief flickered, but it was brittle. He stepped closer. Something was different. The log stacked neatly by the hearth had been shifted. The blanket on the chair was rumpled, though he hadn't touched it since morning. And faint, almost hidden beneath the scent of smoke and salt, another smell. Leather, aftershave, human, his jaw clenched. "Who's there?" His voice was gravel, sharp, startling in the silence. Nothing answered. Shadow whined softly, then moved to the far corner, nose pressed to the floorboards, scratching. The boards creaked faintly beneath the dog's paw. David crouched, pressing a palm to the plank. Loose. Someone had lifted it. He pulled it up. Beneath, a shallow crawl space. Empty, except for the faint scuff marks of boots in the dust. Someone had been there, searching. His pulse hammered. Not kids, not random trespassers. Whoever it was had gone straight to the hiding places, looking for the box. He lowered the board slowly, breathing through his teeth. He checked the latch on the box again, still sealed. The letter and notebook were untouched. Whoever had come had not succeeded or had been interrupted. The unease twisted sharper. The figure he thought he'd seen in the mist, the door ajar, the crawl space disturbed. He was not imagining it. The ghosts of war were not the only ones circling him now. He sat heavily in the chair, rubbing his temple. Shadow leaned against his leg, anchoring him. The weight of the box on the table seemed heavier than ever, as if it was no longer just a relic, but bait. He whispered, "What are you, old man? What did you put in motion when you built that boat?" The fire sputtered, shadows flickering against the walls. His routine, once fortress-like, was in ruins. The letter had cracked it, and now the intrusion had shattered it entirely. Sleep was impossible. He sat through the night, eyes on the door, knife within reach, Shadow awake at his side. Every creak of the cabin was suspect, every gust of wind against the windows a warning. By morning, his decision was made. He couldn't guard this secret alone. The library opened at 9. Eleanor looked up as he entered, her kind face registering the exhaustion etched into his. "Rough night?" she asked gently. David managed a grim nod. I need to know more. About him, about others like him." She gestured toward the computers. "The archive is deeper than it looks. Try the forums, veterans talk there. Sometimes they even find each other." He hesitated, then asked, "Does anyone else come here, asking about the same thing?" Her brows knit faintly. Not that I've seen. Why? David forced a shrug. Just wondering. He sat at the terminal again, fingers clumsy on the keyboard. He navigated to the forums, the section marked Moral Injury, carrying the weight. The screen filled with confessions, lines that cut like blades. I fired because I thought I had to. I chose one man to live and let the other die. The silence afterward is worse than the noise. David's hands shook as he scrolled. These were his thoughts, his nightmares, mirrored in strangers' words. For 50 years he had believed himself monstrous and alone. Now the screen told him he was neither. A new post caught his eye. Username, RiverRat72. We were told it was a hostile village. Called in artillery. No weapons, just families. The old man who survived didn't scream. He just looked at us, and I knew I was the monster in his story. How do you live with that? David's breath stopped. The words mirrored his own memory so precisely that it felt like looking into a mirror. His hand hovered over the keyboard, the urge to respond burning in him, but the fear of exposure pressing harder. He shut his eyes. Shadow's steady presence by his chair steadied him. He typed, slowly, haltingly. You don't. You carry it. But you don't have to carry it alone. He hit enter before he could lose courage. The message appeared on the screen, his voice released into the void. For the first time in decades, he felt something shift inside. Not forgiveness, not absolution, but connection. When he returned to the cabin that evening, the box still sat on the table, untouched. Yet his eyes went immediately to the window, to the tree line. The figure was not there, but the unease lingered. A shadow stretched long and thin. He closed the curtains, bolted the door, and sat with Shadow at his feet. He had taken one step toward the world, one step into the noise he had fled from for so long. And as he sat there, the box between his hands, he thought of Samuel's video. If you are that man, then know you are not alone. He whispered into the silence, I hear you, brother. I hear you. The fire burned low. The night deepened. And just as David began to close his eyes, Shadow's growl rumbled low, sharp. David opened his eyes, heart pounding. The dog stood at the door, body rigid, teeth bared. From outside came the faint crunch of gravel, slow, deliberate, footsteps. Someone was back. The growl in Shadow's throat deepened, vibrating through the floorboards. David's hand slid automatically to the knife at his belt. He held his breath, listening. The footsteps outside crunched slowly over gravel, then stopped. Silence. David rose carefully, his chair legs scraping softly against the wood. He crossed to the window, eased the curtain back a fraction. The fog clung thick to the trees. For a moment, he saw nothing. Then movement just at the edge of vision. A figure, still as a post, half hidden in the mist, watching. David's heart slammed. He let the curtain fall. Whoever it was, they hadn't come to knock. They were measuring him, weighing whether to approach or to break in again. Shadow barked once, sharp, a warning that cut through the silence. The figure melted back into the fog. The crunch of footsteps retreated, fading into the trees. David stood frozen, knife in hand, staring at the door. His breath came shallow. His exile had been ruptured. Someone knew about the boat. Someone wanted it. He spent the night awake, a chair dragged to the window, Shadow pacing restlessly. Each sound outside felt amplified. The groan of pines, the rattle of the wind against the roof. By dawn, exhaustion pressed heavy behind his eyes, but resolve hardened inside him. He couldn't wait for whoever it was to come back. He needed answers. The next day he drove to town. Every mile along the coast road taut with unease. At the diner near the harbor, men in raincoats hunched over coffee, the smell of fried bacon hanging thick. David slid into a booth, ordered black coffee, and listened. Conversations ebbed around him, fish prices, weather, boat repairs, nothing unusual. Then, a voice from the counter caught his attention. Two men, fishermen by the look of them, spoke in low tones. Guy asking questions about an old soldier, one said. Showed a photo. Looked like it was taken back in the 70s. Said he was family. David's pulse quickened. He forced himself to sip his coffee, hands steady. The second man grunted. Family don't usually skulk around the coves. Don't trust him. The first shrugged. Paid cash for everything. Said his name was Keller. Keller. The name meant nothing to David, but it lodged sharp in his mind. Whoever this Keller was, he wasn't just curious, he was searching. When David returned to the library that afternoon, Eleanor greeted him with her usual gentle smile, but her eyes studied him closer than before. You look tired, she said softly. Rough few nights, David admitted. He hesitated, then asked, anyone else been here, looking for stories like mine? Her brow furrowed. Now that you mention it, yes. A man came by yesterday, middle-aged, clean-cut. Said he was researching veterans from the 196th Brigade. He asked if I'd seen anyone in the archive. I didn't give him anything, of course. David's stomach tightened. Did he give a name? She thought. Keller, I believe. The world seemed to tilt slightly. David thanked her and retreated to the back corner computer. He sat heavily, shadow lying at his feet. He typed into the search bar, Keller, 196th Brigade. Dozens of results, none matched. Keller wasn't a veteran, at least not one who had left a trace. David leaned back, rubbing his face. The sense of being hunted pressed tighter. Samuel's confession had reached him, but perhaps others had known of it too. Perhaps Keller wasn't looking for truth or healing. Perhaps he was looking to bury it. That night, David couldn't eat. He sat by the fire, staring at the box. Shadow's head rested on his boot, warm and solid, the one constant. He pulled the notebook from the box, the one Samuel had written in, edges warped with age. He flipped through pages of neat handwriting, measurements of bamboo, resin mixtures, sketches of the boat's frame. But then, deeper in, words darker. They will come for silence. They always do. But silence is the enemy. If you found this, fight the silence. David's skin prickled. It felt as if Samuel had written directly to him, across time, across oceans. He closed the notebook, heart pounding. He whispered to Shadow, "We can't keep this locked up anymore." The next day, he returned to the archive. He logged in, opened the forum again. His post from days earlier had replies now. Strangers thanking him for saying what they couldn't. Words like, "Brother, I understand. We carry it together." He typed again. "I have something that belonged to Sergeant Samuel T. Caldwell. His words, his confession. If you need to hear them, I can share." He hit submit. The message glowed on the screen, irreversible. His secret was no longer his alone. When he returned to the cabin that evening, the gravel drive bore fresh tire tracks. His stomach clenched. He hadn't had visitors in years. The box still sat on the table, untouched, but a folded scrap of paper had been slipped under the door. David picked it up slowly. The paper was blank except for 3 words written in block letters. Leave it be. His hand trembled. Shadow growled, hackles raised. The fire in the stove popped sharply, making David flinch. He looked again at the paper, the blunt threat. Whoever Keller was, he wasn't finished. He was close. Too close. David's gaze shifted to the box. He realized with bone-deep clarity, he was no longer just the keeper of Samuel's story. He was the target of it. Outside, the wind rattled the trees. But beneath it, faint, almost imagined, came the sound of a car engine idling in the distance. Someone was waiting. The note lay on the table, its 3 words burning like a brand. Leave it be. David read it again and again, each time his pulse pounding harder. It was a warning, but also a command. Whoever Keller was, he wanted Samuel's story buried. David stood by the fire, fists clenched, the box heavy on the table between him and the dog that watched silently. His entire life had been built on retreat, on walls and silence, but the letter had cracked those walls. He knew now, silence was complicity. Samuel had written it himself. Fight the silence. He lit a lantern, pulled the notebook toward him, and began writing. His own story poured onto the pages, coordinates relayed, shells raining down, huts and families erased. The words shook, uneven, but they came, raw and unfiltered. He wrote until the lantern guttered low, until his hand cramped and his eyes blurred. When dawn came, the notebook was heavy with his confession. He stared at it, chest hollow, but a strange clarity settled. If Keller wanted silence, then his answer was to make the noise louder. At the library, Eleanor raised her eyes as he entered. She saw the determination in his face and didn't ask questions. He went straight to the terminal, Shadow lying close at his feet. He typed with stiff fingers, uploading Samuel's letter, the scanned pages of the notebook, and finally his own words. The cursor blinked as he hesitated, then pressed submit. The post went live. The keeper of the boat. Within hours, replies appeared. Veterans, families, strangers, words of gratitude, of recognition. Some shared their own stories, others simply wrote, "Thank you for telling the truth." David leaned back, eyes burning. For the first time in 50 years, the weight on his chest felt lighter, not gone, but shared. But when he returned to the cabin, the engine was still there. A black sedan idled just down the road, half hidden in the trees. Its headlights were off, but the shape was unmistakable. Watching, David parked the truck and walked slowly toward his porch. The sedan didn't move. His skin prickled as he stepped inside, bolting the door. Shadow pressed close, restless, pacing. Hours passed, the car unmoving. When night fell, David lit no lamps, sitting in the dark with the box and the dog, listening. At some point, the engine faded into the distance, but he knew it would be back. The next morning, a knock startled him. Not the sharp rap of a stranger, but a hesitant tap. He opened the door a crack. Eleanor stood there, wrapped in her coat, eyes troubled. "I shouldn't be here," she said quietly. "But I thought you should know. That man Keller, he came to the library again. Asked about you directly this time. Said you'd taken something that wasn't yours." David's jaw tightened. "And what did you tell him?" "That I hadn't seen you." She hesitated. "Be careful, David. Whoever he is, he's not just curious." He nodded, gratitude flickering in his chest. When she left, Shadow growled low, sensing his unease. That night, David sat by the fire, box open, letter in hand. He read Samuel's words again. "If you are that man, know you are not alone." He whispered into the silence. "I hear you, and I won't let them silence you." The next day, he drove to town again, not to the library this time, but to the Veterans Hall, a weathered building with peeling paint, its flag flapping in the wind. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and dust, the walls lined with photographs and plaques. A few men sat at tables, playing cards, nursing mugs. He introduced himself quietly. Some recognized his name, some didn't. But when he spoke of Samuel's letter, of the basket boat, of the threat, they listened. Eyes old and weary, but sharp. They had carried their own ghosts. They knew the weight of silence. One man, wiry with white hair, leaned forward. "If someone's trying to bury this, it means it matters. Don't let them." Another clasped his shoulder. "You've already done the hardest part, telling the truth. Now protect it." David left the hall with a new resolve. He was not alone. He had allies, even if fragile. But when he returned home, his stomach dropped. The cabin door was wide open. He ran inside. The box was gone. Panic ripped through him. He tore through the cabin, searching, but it was nowhere. The table was bare, dust showing the outline where it had rested for days. His pulse thundered, his chest heaving. Shadow barked furiously, nose pressed to the floor near the door. Tire tracks outside cut deep into the gravel, fresh. The sedan. David staggered back, breath ragged. They had taken it. Samuel's letter, his confession, his prayer, the heart of it was gone. He collapsed into the chair, hands trembling. His own words were online, yes. The story had begun to spread, but the physical relic, the boat's heart, was in the wrong hands now. Shadow whined, pawing at him, urging him to move. David lifted his head, eyes burning with a fire he hadn't felt in years. "They think they can bury it," he whispered. "But they don't know me. Not anymore." He stood, grabbing his coat, his keys. Shadow bounded to his side, ready. Through the window, the fog hung heavy over the trees. Somewhere out there, the sedan carried the box, Samuel's letter, his story. David clenched his fists. The time for exile was over. And as he stepped out onto the porch, he muttered to the dog, "We're going after it." Somewhere in the distance, faint but distinct, an engine started. The gravel road twisted like a scar along the cliffs, headlights carving tunnels through fog. David gripped the wheel of the old truck, knuckles white, Shadow braced on the passenger seat. The engine groaned on each incline, but his resolve was harder than the rusted steel. Ahead, somewhere in that shifting ocean of mist, Keller had the box. The night air stung sharp through the cracked window. Salt and pine mixed with exhaust, a smell both familiar and foreign. David's mind flickered between two images, Samuel's weary face in the video and the empty table where the box had Saturday. The relic was more than bamboo and resin. It was a man's life distilled into confession, an anchor for every ghost they had carried. To lose it now would be to let silence win. At the edge of Port Orford, the fog thinned enough for David to catch sight of taillights ahead, low, square, unmistakable. The black sedan, his chest tightened. He killed his headlights, coasting in the dark, keeping distance. Shadow whined softly, sensing the hunt. The sedan turned off the main road onto a side track that led toward the abandoned fish cannery. David's pulse quickened. The place was isolated, forgotten, perfect for whatever Keller intended. He eased the truck to the shoulder, cut the engine, and sat in silence. The waves pounded faintly against the cliffs, steady as a drum. "Stay close," David whispered. Shadow pressed against him, ready. They moved on foot, boots crunching gravel, breath ghosting in the cold air. The cannery loomed ahead, a hulking ruin with rusted walls and broken windows. A faint glow seeped through a crack in the boards, a lantern or flashlight. Voices drifted, muffled but tense. David edged closer, crouching low. Through a gap, he saw Keller. Mid-40s, sharp suit under a heavy coat, his face carved with impatience. He stood beside a table where the box rested, open. The letter lay unfolded, Samuel's handwriting stark under the lantern glow. Another man stood with him, broader, silent, clearly muscle. Keller's voice cut sharp. This cannot get out. If these stories spread, they'll rewrite everything. 50 years of history undone. We can't let that happen. The words hit David like a blow. So, that was it. Keller wasn't a relative or curious researcher, he was a cleaner, someone tasked with keeping the past buried. The silent man asked, "So, we burn it?" Keller's jaw tightened. "No, we take it. Lock it away where no one will ever see. The sea should have kept it. We'll finish the job." David's hand clenched on the knife at his belt. His whole life had been silence, Samuel's too. But here, now, he saw the choice clearly. Let Keller bury it again, or stand. Shadow growled low, and Keller's head snapped toward the sound. "Someone's here." David stepped into the doorway, knife glinting in the lantern light. "That doesn't belong to you." The room froze. Keller's eyes narrowed, recognizing him instantly. "So, you're the hermit, the one who found it." He gestured, almost pitying. "You don't understand what you've stumbled into. This is bigger than one soldier's guilt. Let it go." David's voice was gravel. "I've let it go for 50 years, no more." The muscle moved first, lunging. Shadow shot forward, teeth bared, colliding with the man's arm. The struggle erupted, fists, snarls, the lantern toppling. Shadows leapt wild across the rusted walls. David grappled with Keller, the knife pressed to the man's coat, the box inches away. "Think about what you're doing," Keller hissed. "You'll drag ghosts into the light that should stay buried." David shoved him back, voice raw. "They're already here. The only way out is through." The fight crashed through the room. Shadow held his ground, growls echoing as the bigger man tried to shake him off. David lunged for the box, grabbing the letter. Keller slammed him against the wall, fists driving into his ribs. Pain flared white, but David held tight to the pages, crushing them in his fist. For a moment, everything blurred the roar of waves outside, the lantern guttering, the echo of Samuel's voice in his head. "If you are that man, know you are not alone." David rammed his shoulder forward, breaking Keller's grip. He staggered toward the open doorway, Shadow at his side, both of them panting, battered, but alive. He still held the letter, damp with sweat, edges torn. Keller's shout rang behind them. "You can't run forever, Harland. The truth dies with you." David didn't answer. He and Shadow plunged into the fog, boots pounding the gravel, the letter pressed against his chest. They reached the truck, engine sputtering to life, tires spinning against wet stones before catching. The sedan roared behind them, headlights flaring through the mist. The chase along the coastal road was a blur of speed and terror, curves tight against cliffs, waves smashing below. Keller's car loomed in the mirror, closing fast. David gripped the wheel, Shadow braced beside him, the letter fluttering in his hand like a fragile banner. At a narrow stretch of road, he made his choice. He slammed the brakes, the truck skidding sideways. The sedan swerved, tires screaming, barely avoiding the cliff edge. In that split second, David floored the accelerator, vanishing into the fog. He didn't stop until the cabin came into view, its shape emerging from mist like a refuge. He staggered inside, Shadow close, both of them shaking with adrenaline. The box was gone, but the letter creased, torn, but intact remained. He sat at the table, staring at Samuel's words one last time. His chest heaved, ribs aching, but something inside him was steady. The story was already out there. The archive had it now. His post was live, the voices were multiplying. Keller could chase shadows, but the truth was no longer buried. He placed the letter gently on the table, beside his own confession. Shadow lay at his feet, exhausted but watchful. The night pressed close around the cabin, heavy with silence. But it was no longer the silence of exile. It was the silence before the world shifted. David closed his eyes, whispering to the dog, "We did it, boy. He's not alone anymore." A sound cut through the night, soft, deliberate. The crunch of tires on gravel. David's eyes snapped open. He rose slowly, hand tightening on the knife again. Shadow lifted his head, ears pricked, growl rumbling. Headlights flared briefly through the window, then cut out. The cabin was plunged into darkness.